Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining our Junior Energy in-house lawyer webinar series. I'm Louise Mackerlane. I'm a senior associate in the disputes and regulatory team at Burness Paull. I'm qualified in Scotland and in England and Wales, and I have a wide practice across disputes and regulatory issues. So today we're going to be talking about lobbying government and engaging with public decision makers. Before we get started, just some housekeeping. Once you've joined, please ensure that your mute button has been selected to limit any background noise. Today's webinar won't be interactive, but please do feel free to follow up with me or any of your usual Burness Paull contacts if you've got any follow-up questions or if you would like any assistance on any of your projects. Our contact details will be provided at the end of the webinar. Today's webinar is recorded, and if you have any queries about that, please check out our privacy policy, which is available on Burness Paull's website. You'll receive the recording over the next day or so. So why is lobbying government and engaging with public decision makers relevant in this market? Well, energy sector is one of the most heavily regulated, with new legislative and policy developments on a very regular basis. Decisions are made at local, regional and national level, which impact on your operations, which impact on growth. It is a growing sector. It's at the core of individual and national needs. It's of critical national infrastructure at times. And that also means it attracts meaningful scrutiny, particularly where there's geopolitical issues, climate issues, environmental issues. The energy sector does attract some scrutiny from individuals, from politicians, and from the media. Lawyers in this area are more than just looking at black letter law. It's about strategy, policy interpretation, coordinating with stakeholders, market research, and all of that might require either direct or indirect engagement with public officials who have an interest or an influence on any of the issues which affect your business. So what does that look like then? That would be any of these issues. Often seen engaging with public officials can be perceived as something that's a bit opaque or perhaps possibly inappropriate in some circumstances. But the reality is it's an essential part of business and for democracy. It's about ensuring that the decision makers at whatever level they're operating in the public sector do have that access to the best available information when making decisions. Ministers can't and aren't experts in every sector, and they do rely on external input from businesses and advisors to understand how their decisions will come into practice. So that's where your engagement can really add value, bringing practical evidence, technical insight, being able to talk about the implications of a particular decision. And that can be part of delivering an effective service for the business or for your clients. So that might be trying to influence decisions. It might be trying to influence policy when it's being developed at the early stages. It might be providing documentation, technical insight, expert information that you hold that the decision maker doesn't in order to inform their strategy. It might be looking at alternative proposals, suggesting alternatives, workable alternatives that still achieve the same goal, but in your view are more practical or pragmatic. You might be able to highlight how proposed legislation will affect your business, signpost any unintended consequences, identifying legal risks. We've all seen examples where legislation or policy decisions have been made and they've subsequently been effectively challenged because there were unintended consequences. And sometimes those could have been avoided if there had been earlier engagement from stakeholders. And it's also just important to make sure that your views, your clients' views, your organization's views, and their very important input and insight are represented to decision makers. Timing is one thing to think about when you're thinking about lobbying, when to do it. Engaging early is always going to be most effective, rather than trying to influence once legislation or policy has been set. The key message throughout the session today is going to be that engaging and lobbying isn't something that needs to be opaque or complex. It's about conversations. It's about being able to advance strategy and interests. And that informs participation in public decision making when it's done openly and responsibly can be really effective and is really important beyond just your organisation. It's very important for democracy. So the purpose of the session is to set out some of the applicable frameworks that might apply in your activities in lobbying or engaging with these decision makers. We're going to look at some of the frameworks that bind those officials, starting with the codes of conduct and then moving into regulated lobbying. And the aim is, as I say, to facilitate confident engagement and a better understanding of the considerations an official might have in mind to allow you to have more constructive and effective engagement. So, who is it? Well, the officials might be elected, so it might be MSPs, MPs, councillors, and ministers. By virtue of being elected, they are subject to more enhanced scrutiny, but there are non-elected members who are relevant, special advisors, civil servants, regulators, all of whom who make important decisions and you may be engaging with on a day-to-day basis. As a general rule, it's the ministers that set the policy direction, and it's the civil servants who implement and advise, and the special advisors provide that political input. The approach to engagement and the degree to which the legal considerations bite will differ depending on who you're engaging with and also on how you're engaging with them. So broadly, there's three strands that might be used as engagement with decision makers, with public officials. Formal is thinking of those one-on-one consultations, planning representations, perhaps committee evidence, really focused one-on-one invite specific engagement or evidence giving. Informal, probably one of the most common, meetings, roundtables, consultations, hospitality, perhaps email correspondence, bulletins, things like that. And the indirect is where there's trade association, media, any third party that is advocating on behalf of the organisation with the decision maker. For all of those types of activities, the codes of conduct and the ethical standards are going to be relevant to the decision maker. We're primarily going to look at the codes of conduct and then turn to regulated lobbying. The conduct sets out the broad principles that are applicable for all types of engagement and really for all of the public officials who might be making relevant decisions for you. So turning first then to the ministerial codes, starting at the top with the Scottish ministers. They're bound by this code, which was significantly revamped under Nicola Sturgeon in 2018, but has been revamped a couple of times since then to reflect growing needs and more information. This sets out within the code the 7 principles of public life: selflessness, integrity, objectivity, accountability, openness, honesty, and leadership. And that binds all of the ministers. It doesn't set out prescriptive rules as such. It's more about general principles that ministers ought to have in mind at all times when acting. Really at the core, what the code is tilting at is to have the ministers acting at all times in the public interest, not for personal political gain. So selflessness and integrity, it's about avoiding conflicts of interest. And objectivity is about ensuring that decisions are based on evidence rather than bias or any improper influence. Accountability and openness are very important. It's about transparency. Ministers must be prepared to explain and justify their decisions to Scottish Parliament and to the public. They should have an approach of disclosure and of clarity in their actions. It's not just about their actions formally as a minister in terms of making policy decisions. It's about how they engage with everyone around them, their colleagues, but also stakeholders and the public. It really reinforces their responsibilities to comply with the law and maintain trust in public office. And leadership really sets out that the ministers are not just to follow these principles, but they're to actively promote a culture that upholds them across government. So the idea is that the example set at the top by ministers will filter down throughout all of government. And that's what ministers should have in mind when they're engaging with stakeholders, when they're engaging with third parties. The Code of Conduct for Holyrood has more prescriptive rules, it's less principle-based. It has some specific requirements within it when looking at it from the angle of lobbying or engaging with stakeholders. So where an MSP accepts any form of hospitality, meals, events, travel, accommodation, anything that's over £300 in value must be declared on a public register. That's a register of interests, and it's got to be registered within a fixed time frame. Any hospitality must avoid creating or even appearing to create a conflict of interest or obligation. It's not just about an absolute conflict of interest, but about the perception of a conflict of interest or obligation that could allow a reasonable bystander to think there was improper influence. In addition to that, even if the hospitality meets those requirements, it's below the £300 value or it's above it but has been reported, it's going to be registered, there's no risk of a conflict of interest. The hospitality accepted should still be proportionate and occasional, so reasonable, infrequent, and relevant to parliamentary duties. MSPs can also contact the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee to ask for advice on the acceptance of any hospitality. There's also a complete ban on paid advocacy. MSPs cannot promote or act on behalf of a provider of hospitality in return for benefits. That also applies to MSPs, spouses, civil partners, and cohabitants. Layered on top of that again is that if MSPs are taking hospitality or meeting with lobbyists or a campaigning group, MSPs are recommended to consider balance and offer the opportunity to other groups if they meet with one group. So if offering hospitality, engaging with those MSPs, having all of this in mind in terms of the value, the disclosure, the purpose, and also that it may lead to the MSP meeting with other groups is all quite important. The Code of Conduct then for councillors, it's very similar. It has the principles. It also has some prescriptive rules. Councillors must never seek any hospitality or gift unless it is very minor and infrequent, or which would reasonably be associated with their duties as a councillor. But councillors must also not accept any gift or hospitality from an individual or an applicant who's awaiting a decision or seeking to do business with that council. So it really narrows it down to what a councillor is allowed to accept. It sets quite a high bar and really focuses the test on how a member of the public would perceive the behaviour. In engaging with stakeholders or third parties, councillors must think about whether a member of the public with knowledge of the facts would reasonably regard the conduct as being likely to influence my or the council's decisions. In addition, Scottish Government has produced guidance, which most councils have adopted, about engaging particularly with developers or those awaiting planning decisions. And the risk, if any engagement is considered inappropriate or untoward, well, any decision maker that you've been engaging with, if it considers itself to be at risk of breaching the code of conduct, might voluntarily recuse themselves and take themselves out of the decision-making process, which might undermine any work that you've undertaken so far to influence the decision. And those members might also be subject to criminal or civil sanctions. They can be subject to an investigation by the Ethical Standards Commissioner. All of that comes with reputational risk, bad publicity for the decision maker or the official, and for you. There can be complaints made about the decision makers, about the areas of government. And all of that could result in a challengeable decision, so a decision that is subject to judicial review. And as a general rule, anything that is a written record could be disclosed under freedom of information. So any efforts could be disclosed in that way. So, lobbying. Lobbying is really just when a person, either individually, with others, for others, tries to influence decision makers, getting an issue on the agenda, pursuing a policy, bringing about change in law, by any range of activities mentioned earlier, consultations, conferences, meetings, demonstrations, letters, emails, all of that is lobbying. Everything we talked about is lobbying, and the code of conduct would apply to ministers, to officials when they are being lobbied. However, what we are going to be talking about for the next 10 minutes or so is about restricted lobbying. And that is a very narrow part of lobbying, which is subject to additional regulation. When we talk about it being regulated, the purpose is to increase transparency, to increase accountability and openness, to ensure decision makers are held accountable. It is not about preventing lobbying or throwing up hurdles. It's really aimed at that transparency piece. I won't go into this in detail, but for your reference, the framework is different in Scotland and England and Wales. It's the 2016 Act in Scotland and the Transparency of Lobbying, Non-Party Campaigning and Trade Union Administration Act 2014 in England and Wales in terms of Westminster. The Code of Conduct all still apply here. So what we have is the legislation for regulated lobbying, but at all times, for all of those activities, the codes of conduct will still apply. So, regulated lobbying in respect of Holyrood, in respect of MSPs. That's a regulated activity where it is an oral communication. It's in person with an official who is an MSP, a minister, or a special advisor. And it's about government functions. So what that doesn't include, it doesn't include written communications, noting that, of course, anything written could be caught by FOI. It doesn't include public meetings, so an oral communication that's made in a public meeting wouldn't count. And it doesn't cover communications that are in response to requests for information. So those aren't caught by regulated lobbying at all. And then on the left, we have the exemptions. Those are activities that might otherwise fall under regulated lobbying, but are exempted. And these are for public policy reasons. These are to allow MSPs and ministers to carry out their functions as a constituency MSP, engaging with journalism, political parties, trade unions, working with individual constituents, but also for certain public officials where their role might require them to have those one-on-one meetings in order to gather evidence or something similar. So there's a 5-step test. If it is one of those oral communications in respect of functions, and that opportunity has been used to inform or influence decisions, You are paid for representing those views. So it's your organization or you're doing it for a third party who has paid for that. And it doesn't benefit for those exemptions. It's going to be regulated lobbying. What does that mean? It means that there is a trigger for registration. So if regulated lobbying is carried out in respect of any of those covered officials, you have to register, the organisation or the individual has to register on a publicly searchable register within 30 days. And once on that register, there must be quarterly reportings returned that cover the attendees, the purpose of any meeting, and the description of any meeting. The Clerk of Parliament monitors that register for compliance and has powers to seek information to monitor that compliance. A failure to register and report when required is an offence. It can result in conviction, or if on conviction, can result in up to 3 months custodial sentence and £1,000 fine for each offence. And it has corporate liability, so directors, partners, or managers can be held liable if the offence was as a result of their actions. You can register voluntarily on this register. A lot of organisations have. That's either done for transparency, to allow for that public record and to give confidence to anyone they meet with that they are, if they're meeting with advisors or ministers, that the organisation is acting transparently and is aware of these obligations. Just for reference, this is what it looks like. First group, it says the purpose, who they met with, and the communication type. And you can search the register by who the MSP or the member. Westminster is very different. Only consultant lobbyists can carry out regulated lobbying. Otherwise, it's not regulated. Similarly, on behalf of a third party, in the course of business, but oral or written communications, but narrower in that it's only government ministers or permanent secretaries. So a consultant lobbyist is those lobbying on behalf of clients in return for payment. It doesn't include in-house lobbyists or most law firms because it's incidental to legal advice. And it doesn't include backbench MPs, staff or peers, which is quite interesting as at least 50 members of the House of Lords last year worked for lobbying firms. But it's the organisation or the individual that registers as a consultant lobbyist. So the House of Lords members that lobbied would not have to be registered. Again, if you're carrying out regulated lobby, you must be registered. But in Westminster, you must first be on the register to carry out lobbying. The offence is the same, failure to register or to report on the quarterly basis can result in a conviction of 3 months or a fine of up to £1,000. But the register is much lighter. There's no requirement to disclose the meetings, the subject matter, or the amounts. The reports look like this, which is simply a record of the organisation and the clients lobbied for, but not the activities undertaken to lobby. So, just by way of comparison, Holyrood, if your regulated lobbying could be triggered, those obligations and risks if it's based on the activity. It does cover in-house lobby, so on behalf of your employer. It doesn't cover written communications and does require more enhanced disclosure. In Westminster, it's much narrower. That is exemplified in the register. One has far more information. There are also 1,700 registered lobbyists in Scotland and 256 in Westminster. So very different regimes, very different narrow interpretations of regulated lobbying. Generally engaging with public decision makers, you need to be aware that at this point, as of tomorrow, we are in the pre-election period, sometimes called purdah, And that's the 6 weeks prior to polling day, where ministers should continue to conduct essential business, but any decisions on policy should be deferred. And anything that is initiating a new action or something that has a continuing or long-term character should be paused. There's very detailed Scottish Government guidance on this. And if you are engaging with government in the next 6 weeks, it's really worth having a look at that guidance, as it will help set out the framework within which the decision makers should be acting over the coming weeks. So the key takeaways, back to the purpose of the session, is again, lobbying, engaging with decision makers can be really effective. It's very important. It's important for the organisations, but it is also important and useful for the decision makers to have your evidence, your information, and your insight. To make sure that it's as constructive as possible, knowing what codes might apply, knowing which obligations the officials are subject to, is helpful in making sure your engagement is framed effectively, and that at all times the decision maker is reassured of everything being done compliantly and transparently. Knowing what regulating lobbying looks like means that you can identify and comply with any of those requirements. You can also make good use of the register, see what competitors are doing, see who else is meeting with those MSPs and ministers that you would like to meet with. Keep a record of those activities. Make sure you've got a joint approach internally. Be aware of the risks, know what actions you need to take or avoid, and continue to make the most of those opportunities to engage. I set out here some of the links. The lobbying registers, definitely worth having a look at, particularly I would say Holyrood register, as it just has that little bit more information available, and you can see who's meeting with those decision makers and what might be of interest to you. The codes, also a range of codes from the Councillor, Ministerial, House of Commons and the House of Lords. And that brings us to the end of today's session. If you would like to hear any more about any of the topics covered, or you have any specific queries, please do reach out. We'd be very, very happy to hear from you. My details are there, and you'll find me on our website. Our session has been recorded, and you'll receive an email with a link to the recording as well. And we also have our upcoming sessions. They're shown on the slide here. Please do sign up, check out the next sessions on an introduction to project finance and renewable energy, and then corporate crime liability. And thanks very much for joining today's webinar, and we look forward to seeing you at our future sessions. Thanks very much.